Beer was so common in ancient Egypt, kids drank it for breakfast. And we're not talking about watered-down wine here. This was sort of like thick, warm, yeasty porridge in a jar. And it wasn't a treat. It was your paycheck. So, what does that tell us about survival, labor, and the price of progress? And what other cheap meals did the ancient Egyptians have just to stay alive? You see, during the Pharaonic period, so roughly 3100 to 332 BC, most Egyptians ate to survive. If you were a laborer, a farmer, or just not born into wealth, your daily meals came down to a few basic things. First off, bread was the big one. Made from emmer wheat or barley, it was the backbone of every meal. Everyone ate it, rich, poor, priest, peasant. But making it was rough. Grains had to be ground by hand, using stone tools. That meant the flour was full of sand or gravel. Yes, actual sand. So the bread wasn't exactly fluffy. Think dense, unleavened flatbreads with a side of dental erosion. And we know this because a lot of mummies show teeth that were worn down to their gums. So yeah, centuries of chewing gravel bread will do that. But the basic recipe was simple: flour, water, and salt. Baked in clay ovens or over open fires. And if you were rich, maybe you got honey or spices. But if not, then you've got calories and crumbs. And they made a lot of it. At Giza, for instance, the workers' town near the pyramids, archaeologists found thousands of broken bread molds. Big conical pots called bedja, some over 10 kilos each. They used these to bake communal loaves in giant ovens. Basically, ancient mass production. Tomb scenes back this up too. Models from the Middle Kingdom show bakeries in action. Grinding, mixing, baking. Bread was a whole operation. Feeding the workforce was infrastructure. And then there's beer. Not pub beer, mind you. Ancient Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, and more like liquid porridge. They made it by fermenting crumbled bread or sprouted barley in water. It was full of carbs, protein, and B vitamins. A drinkable meal, basically. And it was everywhere. Kids drank it. Adults drank it. It was safer than water and filled you up. Most households brewed it themselves or got it from community breweries. And here's the key part. It wasn't just for fun. Beer and bread were your paycheck. Literally. You see, texts from pyramid sites talk about commissaries, places where workers lined up for daily rations. And the standard issue was bread and beer. And that's how labor got paid. Build a monument, get a loaf and a jug. Not a bad deal, all things considered. But in 1158 BC, Egypt had a problem. The workers building royal tombs at Deir el-Medina put down their tools and walked off the job. Why? Well, there was no wheat. Their grain rations were late, so they had to buy food themselves. And that was not part of the deal. Eventually, the officials opened up emergency stores, and only then did the workers return to their chisels and paintbrushes. This could have been the first labor strike in recorded history, over carbs. But not all grain ended up as bread. Sometimes it just got boiled. Cracked barley, or emmer wheat, when cooked with water, turns into a sort of porridge. It was filling, cheap, and didn't need fancy pots or much firewood. Basically, the ancient version of just add hot water. Now, we don't have full recipes, but there are clues like rusty bowls, ceramic strainers, and traces of cereal mash in old hearths. So the picture is clear. People were cooking this stuff at home, regularly, and most of it was plain. Salt, if you had some, maybe a bit of onion for flavor. But mostly it was just hot grain mush. Still, when your other option is chewing gravel bread, a bowl of porridge isn't the worst thing. But as for protein, meat was a luxury. So legumes were the go-to. Lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans. These were staples across centuries. They turned up in stews, soups, and slow boils in clay pots. Lentils in particular are everywhere in the archaeological record. Dried, charred, and dumped in trash heaps, lentils were all over the place. Experts say that workers at the pyramids were more likely powered by lentils than lamb chops. So, yeah, beans built empires. Okay, not single-handedly, but you get the idea. You see, legumes packed the protein that bread didn't, and they kept well, cheap, storable, and easy to cook. Again, we don't get many exact recipes in Egyptian texts, but the way people today still cook fool, or mashed fava beans, or lentil soups gives us a hint. Imagine a big clay pot bubbling over a fire, and inside you've got lentils, maybe onions, some greens tossed in, whatever was on hand. Bread was dipped in, and stew was scooped out. Tomb scenes show cooks at big pots, stirring thick stews, and that's likely what they were making, bean and veggie blends, seasoned with whatever herbs or wild greens they could find. Then there was purslane, mallow, leeks, and garlic, all fair game. Basic and simple, but filling. There's even a New Kingdom mention of peas and spices boiled together. Maybe this was the earliest version of pea soup? Could be. But onions and garlic were somehow essential. They were cheap, easy to grow, and full of flavor. And for Egypt's working class, that mattered. Because when your meals are mostly bread and beans, anything that kicks up the taste is gold. Now these allium vegetables showed up in garden plots everywhere, from family backyards to estate farms, and they would also be buried with people. Garlic bulbs, for instance, have turned up in tombs, including King Tut's. Apparently, you really could take it with you. Yeah, the ancient Egyptians knew their value, but the Greeks definitely noticed it too. Herodotus claimed that an inscription on Khufu's pyramid listed 1,600 silver talents spent on radishes, onions, and garlic to feed the builders. But was that number real? Who knows? But the point stands. Garlic and onions were feeding some of the labor force. A lot of them, actually. Garlic, in particular, had a reputation. It was supposed to boost strength and fend off disease. So naturally, overseers made sure workers and soldiers got plenty. These bulbs were eaten raw with bread or tossed into lentil stews for flavor. And onions, they were everywhere. Tomb paintings from the New Kingdom show green onions, leeks, you name it. One Ramesside text even calls onions the sweet one. Maybe this was a stretch, but if you rarely tasted anything sugary, an onion probably did feel like dessert. Other vegetables filled in when they were in season. Radishes and turnips were grown, though big radishes were often crushed for their seeds instead of eaten raw, because, well, raw radish could cause gas. And if you've got 100 workers in a quarry, that's less than ideal. Lettuce was another go-to. It shows up in tomb art, often being harvested or bundled. It might have been eaten raw or cooked down in stews. Its seeds were also pressed for oil because nothing went to waste. There's even mention of celery or parsley, likely a local marsh celery, used to season food or add greenery to a meal. It doesn't sound glamorous, but this stuff mattered. A pot of boiled greens was a change in texture, color, and even flavor. A break from the monotony. As for spices, they weren't importing saffron or cinnamon, but local herbs did the trick. Coriander seeds, called jejenu, have been found in worker villages. They were probably tossed into stews or baked into bread for some extra bite. Other herbs like dill, fenugreek, and mustard were known too. They might have grown right next to the kitchen, useful for cooking and medicine. Salt was available, but used with care. It came from salt pans or natron deposits, and was more about preserving food than making it tasty. Some archaeologists have found spice seeds in clay jars and residue in old cooking pots, which tells us even the humblest meals had flavor. A pinch of coriander, a handful of wild herbs. Maybe not a feast, but just enough to make dinner taste like something. However, not all food came from fields or farms. For Egypt's poor, the wild was a backup plan, and sometimes a regular part of the menu. You see, when crops failed or rations ran thin, people turned to the marshes, riverbanks, and whatever the land gave up for free. And honestly, Egypt was generous. The Nile's yearly flood created these extensive, soggy wetlands full of edible plants. Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian visiting in the 1st century BC, basically said, "This place has everything: roots, fruits, greens, even stuff the sick can live on." Which sounds dramatic, but he wasn't wrong. Because even in earlier times, people were foraging. Lotus roots, water lilies, papyrus stalks. If it grew in the mud, someone was probably eating it. And yes, papyrus wasn't only used for scrolls. The tender inner pith could be chewed plainly or boiled like a vegetable. One inscription even calls it nourishing, which is ancient for good enough. Archaeologists have also found burned water lily seeds and lotus seeds in settlement layers. Apparently, people ground them into flour or roasted them like nuts. And speaking of nuts, there were also tiger nuts, also called earth almonds. These were tiny sweet tubers from the sedge plant. They grew wild, tasted good, and could be eaten plain or mashed into cakes with honey. And hey, if grain was running low, you could always go grass picking. Sedge, wild millet. It was better than going hungry. Now, after the main harvest, poor villagers would also scrape together whatever they find. And that meant combing through harvested fields for leftover wheat or barley stalks. Tomb art shows this clearly, like in the Tomb of Menna, where workers trail behind the reapers, grabbing what's left. Texts don't explain it in detail, but the practice was likely accepted and widespread. After all, no one charged you gold for picking up scraps. All it cost was time and sore knees. The point is, once you strip out the luxuries and the imports, you're left with a diet that was humble, seasonal, and shaped by what the land and the Nile could give. So the next time you hear about the glory of ancient Egypt, the pyramids, the temples, and the gold, remember, it all ran on bread, beans, and a few cups of warm, chunky beer. This makes you think about how much of history was built on meals no one bothered to write down.